Grateful to be with you. Once again, good morning, Jonathan Blake. I thought I would read a few verses of poetry to begin. I won't say much about the poem or who wrote it until after I read a few verses. So I'm just going to read excerpts. This poem is called Be'ir HaHarega in Hebrew. Be'ir HaHarega, which means in the city of slaughter. I'm reading it in translation from the Hebrew. Arise and go now to the city of slaughter. Into its courtyard wind your way. There with your own hand touch, and with the eyes of your head behold on tree, on stone, on fence, on mural clay, the spattered blood and dried brains of the dead. Proceed then to the ruins. The split walls reach, where wider grows the hollow and greater grows the breach. Pass over the shattered hearth, attain the broken wall, those burnt and barren brick, whose charred stones reveal the open mouths of such wounds that no mending shall ever mend, nor healing ever heal. I'm going to skip a little bit. Behold, the shadow of death among the shadows stands. Crushed in their shame, they saw it all. They did not pluck their eyes out. They beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps each watcher had it in his heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this day. Come now, I will bring you to their lairs, the privies, jakes, and pigpens, where the heirs of the Hasmoneans lay with trembling knees, concealed and cowering, the sons of the Maccabees, the seed of saints, the scions of the lions, who crammed by scores in all the sanctuaries of their shame, so sanctified my name. It was the flight of mice they fled, the scurrying of roaches was their flight. They died like dogs, and they were dead. How old is this poem? Okay, so we've so far identified three possible timelines. The Crusades, 12th century, 12th, 13th century. The period of the Maccabees, which was approximately the first 2 centuries before the Common Era. Somebody else ventured to guess. I heard a third timeline. Masada, the year 74 of the Common Era. Could have been written 4 weeks ago. It was not written 4 weeks ago. It is only 120 years old. It is called Be'ir HaHarega, in the city of slaughter. It was written by Chaim Nachman Bialik, born in the 1870s in actually what is today Ukraine. Probably he and our ancestors would have just called it Russia. I know in my family, the tradition is we come from Russia. It was Belarus today, but it was part of what would become the Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia, or the Pale of Settlement. And he wrote it in 1903, following the most consequential pogrom of the time, the attack on the Russian city of Kishinev, where Jewish homes were ransacked, synagogues as well, and Jewish people were murdered with such brutality that this poem, which endeavors to be a unflinching accounting of the violence, is, I think, without a doubt, and by a significant measure, the most important poem of the 20th century in the Jewish community, in its effect. How many of you have ancestors who left the old country for the new country between 1904 and 1910? Yeah, that's a significant number. My family all came over between 1904 and 1910. And although there are lots of different kind of like family lores that have been passed down about why my great-grandparents on both sides of the family all left So all 8 of my great-grandparents left within a 6-year period, 1904 to 1910. There's a lot of family tradition around, well, they didn't want to be conscripted into the Tsar's army. That was a fate that awaited many Jews under Tsarist Russia. I am convinced more than ever that the widespread publicity about the Kishinev pogrom was actually the prompting incident for most of the hands that are in this room. The news reached the Jewish community the same way there is not a Jewish person who hasn't been hiding under a rock over the last 5.5 weeks who isn't aware of what happened on October 7th and the abject brutality of the attacks that Hamas inflicted upon Israel. And so here we are. We're here to learn about the history of Zionism, Israel, and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. I'm attempting to present a lot of material over the course of 4 90-minute sessions on mostly consecutive Sundays, with the exception of Sunday, November 26th, which is Thanksgiving weekend. So same bat time, same bat channel, this Sunday, next Sunday, December 3rd, December 10th. And then like a fun, interesting, deep bonus session on the 17th taught by Cantor Kleinman, which will explore Zionism and the conflict through art and music, especially, with some guest musicians. So it's more of a salon, it's right before winter break, and hopefully it allows the class to end on something of a comforting or a healing note, though I suspect that discomfort will be the predominant theme of our learning together. There may, however, be some comfort simply in advancing our knowledge set and in feeling we're not alone. Look at this incredible turnout this morning. This is really wonderful. We made 60 handouts, so there are still more on the front row. So if you didn't yet receive a handout and you're seated here, raise a hand and Dina or Sam will help distribute a few. And otherwise, you are welcome to share with people next to you. We had 60 people register, so if we're a little bit above registration, I'm thrilled. I apologize that staff didn't run off one for every single person, but hopefully the print is big enough we can all look at it together. I'd like to, and I have to use the microphone just for the benefit of the streamers. I apologize, it feels a little bit like big room voice. I've written on the board, Zionism is, and without trying to be academic, and I don't like playing gotcha or guess what the rabbi's thinking. I just like beginning a course of study by inviting us to feel that it's okay to share whatever we have to say. So this is more of like free association than asking you for an answer to a question that would be unfair to ask since we haven't actually learned anything yet. But what do you think Zionism is? And the more compact you can express this, the better. Like, I don't have the time or the bandwidth to write paragraphs up here. Right, so what is Zionism? Michael. Okay. Good. A Jewish state in the land of Israel. Great. Others. Yes, Patty.
Being supportive of the Jewish citizenship.
Okay, great. Yes, Alan.
So I would say it's an ideology that is not essential to defending the legitimacy of the modern state of Israel. I think one can believe in the legitimacy of the state of Israel without having an ideology.
I'm not sure I'm following. It is, okay, so it's an ideology, but it's the second part of your sentence that needs a little unpacking, Alan. It is not essential.
Because different people will have a different understanding of what the ideology means. Some will think it means God gave this land to the Jews. Some will think it derives from history.
Got it.
So there are a lot of different ideas that can come into Zionism. You don't have to have those ideas to say to the people who are in Israel have a right to live there, to govern themselves, to defend themselves. And I think you could more easily convince people who are not Jewish in other countries of the legitimacy of Israel's position in the region, its legitimacy as a state. We don't wrap it into an ideology.
All right, I'm going to try and compress that down. Okay. An ideology or ideologies, plural, which are not necessary for supporting today's state of Israel. Israel is I, period. Okay, good. Yes, Marcy.
Not sure, but Israel always thought it was.
Yes. Okay. Put in quotes. Good. Others. Yep, Sandra. Forgive my poor handwriting today. A dream of returning home. Anyone else? Zionism is Sarah.
This is either the same thing that I said or the inverse. Not 100% sure. But it's support of the existence of the state of Israel without necessarily supporting the Israeli government. So essentially, the right of the state of Israel to exist.
Okay, not necessarily its government. Anything else? Yeah, Len. Question. Great. 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 The first reading we're doing as a class today touches on exactly that question. Hold that question. It's a perfect question. Actually, it's a great question for the top of our study. Any other? Yep, Fran? I missed the first word. Yeah, essential survival. Too many words. Okay, the essential survival of the Jewish people requires the existence of Israel. Yeah, I know that I'm warping your words. Others? Yep, Ken. Okay, so I'm going to comment on the first one. Okay, now a Jewish star means the Jewish people. Good. Anyone else? Okay, yeah, Michelle.
Jewish nationalism.
Aha. Okay. Great. All right. This is a good juncture to pause. Just the fact that we've filled a board and probably could keep going for the rest of these minutes together indicates that Zionism is a multitude of things, and that any representative community of Jewish people may not necessarily know what it is or be in agreement with what it is. And I promise you, this would play out exactly the same way in Israel today, with any group. They could do this in an Orthodox synagogue, and they would not be more knowledgeable or have better answers. They'd have great answers like all of these, and I think that every single one of these is a great answer that encapsulates some legitimate truth about what Zionism is, and yet not the whole picture. Finding just one source to read about Israel, the history of Zionism, and the conflict is an impossible task. For the purpose of what we're going to be learning today, I am reviewing a lot of my notes, both my study notes from rabbinical school, my lecture notes from previous standalone classes. I taught a mini course on Zionism, though it was formatted very differently in 2018. But a book has been published pretty recently called Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. It is, so if you just look up online, Israel, A Concise History by Daniel Gordis, Gordis. It was published in 2016, so it does not reflect the last 7 years of history, which is important. I mean, that's the other problem with any book about Israel. It's outdated within 6 months. But I really think that if you're looking for a really well-written, easy to read, real page-turner kind of book, and you want one volume that you won't bite off more than you can chew. Israel: A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Daniel Gordis, widely available. You can order it through your local bookseller, either online or in brick and mortar places. I think they still have copies at Barnes & Noble. Maybe Bronx River Books is stocking them. I imagine they are. It's my favorite local bookseller in the village. I'm rereading the book right now, and it's really good. I think that it is historically accurate and balanced and filled with interesting facts and figures, but also interesting anecdotes about personalities, both the big ones and some of the more obscure ones. It is not, it's not the whole story, but it's a really good one-volume story. The other book that I'm using for this class, which is more of it's not the kind of book that you're going to read from cover to cover. It's more of a book you keep on your shelf and pull out for reference, but I'll be producing handouts with readings from this book. There was a book that I had to read in college for a course on Israel called The Zionist Idea by Arthur Hertzberg. It has been updated by Gil Troy, the editor. It's called now The Zionist Ideas, which I think is incredibly significant. That this new edition, which basically took a 40-year-old book or a 50-year-old book and updated it for the modern audience and for modern times, correctly claims that Zionism is a set of ideas, not just one ideology, but that's why I like when Alan said ideology or ideologies, right? Zionism as a set of ideas or conversations, often in conflict with one another, about the how and even the why, not so much in conflict with each other about the what, but even sometimes the what. Like, what are we supposed to do? So we're going to talk a lot about Zionism, and this is a book, an anthology of primary sources, all the way up to the 2010s. So, you want to know what Theodor Herzl said in his own words, in translation, it's in here. But you also want to know what Yossi Klein Halevi has to say about Israel, very much alive on the lecture circuit. He wrote a number of great books, including Like Dreamers and Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, which we'll probably get to in one of our latter classes. It's in here. So outstanding resource, but we'll also be producing photocopies from it. So that's called The Zionist Ideas, edited by Gil Troy. So these are the two primary sources. Again, I'm trying to make this course approachable. This is not like a college semester length deep reading class. And you don't need to read the books in order to derive a lot from this time together, but it will enhance it. And I certainly don't claim to have any of it memorized, but I'll narrate as we go. So I think that Len asked a great million-dollar question to get us started. And in order to understand the answer to the question, what is Zionism, you need to know a little bit about the Jewish people and what we were thinking about 150 years ago, give or take, 140, 150 years ago. So the handout is now where we will turn. And today's lesson is called Zionism, Roots and Branches. The goal of today's class is to frame the different ideologies or Zionist ideas that are foundational in the establishment of a Jewish state in what was then Palestine. We will probably proceed more or less chronologically, but we will also proceed ideologically, so we'll look at the different competing, conflicting, and sometimes convergent ideas around what Zionism is. And I don't know how far we're going to get today. I think the pace of the class will inform my realistic expectations about what I can do next week, and then 2 weeks after on December 3rd, and then for the final class. But, I think that if we can get through the First World War today, from the 1880s, let's say, to the First World War, a little bit before the 1880s, because we got to set the stage, we'll be in good shape. And then next week, we'll do everything from the end of World War I up until the end of World War II. The third week, we'll really do the history of Israel and the Palestinian conflict from the establishment of the state through probably the First Intifada, so the late 80s. And then in the last class together on December 10th, we'll really try and tackle everything from the after the First Intifada to the present day. So that's sort of in my head how I expect to do this, but again, a little bit fly by the seat of our pants. The Russian Jewish novelist Peretz Smolenskin, born in 1842, died in 1885. A lot of these guys did not live very long. They lived until their mid-40s. That was just sort of the way it was back then. And they, I think, also were living at a time of acute stress, so it wouldn't surprise me if all of these fellas died of heart conditions. Herzl himself did at the age of 44. This is from an essay called "It is Time to Plant." And normally I do like to invite readers from the congregation, but because we're live streaming, I'm using the mic so that they can hear. So I'm going to be today's reader, not to make this too frontal, but I think it will be the best way to proceed. Here is an excerpt from "It is Time to Plant," which was written between 1875 and 1877. The Jewish people, there you go, Len, just let's talk about what that means in a minute, has outlived all others because it has always regarded itself as a people, a spiritual nation. Yes, we are a people. We have been a people from our beginnings until today. We have never ceased being a people, even after our kingdom was destroyed and we were exiled from our land, and whatever may yet come over us will not eradicate our national character. But we are not today a people like all others, just as we were not a people like the others even when we dwelt in our own land. The foundation of our national identity was never the soil of the Holy Land, and we did not lose the basis of our nationality when we were exiled. We have always been a spiritual nation, one whose Torah was the foundation of its statehood. Oh, there's a lot going on in here. So Smolenskin begins with a kind of primary definition of what it means to be a Jew. It means that you belong to a people. And he makes it clear that without that kind of identity, we don't have the ability to last in the historical circumstances into which Jewish people have been thrust. But he also wants to make it clear that even though we are a people like any number of other peoples, whether they are Poles or Turks or Ottomans, what have you, we are not conventionally a people because we retained a sense of peoplehood even after exile from our land. So let's go all the way back to the beginning. If you want to understand Zionism, then we'll kind of play this into Smolenskin and the other early Zionist thinkers. The Jewish people has a story that goes back, let's say conservatively, 3,500 years. It is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years old. We don't really know because we don't have archaeological evidence of people who called themselves Jews earlier than, say, 1000 BCE. I use BCE, which is the proper academic terminology, as opposed to before Christ. Like, we don't do the BC thing, we're Jews. So before the Common Era, which is Christian. So sometimes I just, it's before the Christian era, like before we started counting years by when Jesus came around. So for 1,000 years BCE, we have hard evidence of Jewish civilization. Before that, though, it's a little bit dicey. You know, if you try to map what the Torah tells us about Jewish history against what archaeological evidence and other textual evidence might suggest, the Exodus might have taken place. If it did, it might have taken place 1200, 1300 BCE. But it's not like we have a casket with Moses' bones in it, right? We don't have any of these relics. All we have is the Torah's own word, and we know that the Torah is not history, it's our story. Having said that, there's massive evidence of Israelite civilization in this part of the world. But there are a lot of things that the Torah claims that we don't have archaeological evidence for. Like for instance, an exodus from Egypt. There's just no evidence of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Israelites in the Egyptian empire at any point in Egyptian history. And You know, because it fills museums, that there is so much Egyptology. I mean, there's been so much archaeological evidence from all of the different periods of Egyptian empires. You might think that 600,000 Jewish men of fighting age leading a slave rebellion, under the rule of Ramses II, who was one of the most, famous of the pharaohs, it might have registered in Egyptian record keeping somewhere. It doesn't. So what is this? It doesn't matter. It's our story. However, there is vast evidence of a Jewish civilization in this part of the world, in what we call Eretz Yisrael, starting at around 1000. The kingdoms of Saul and David and Solomon, even if they didn't play out the way the Bible tells us they did, there is huge amounts of evidence of Israelite civilization in the land at that time. The Torah itself even acknowledges we were not the indigenous people of the land. The Torah makes reference to many other nations which have been backed up archaeologically. I talked about this on Friday night, people like the Hittites. And the way in which the Israelite nation came to actually possess the land is a story that will never fully be uncovered. We don't know. It almost certainly didn't happen the way the Torah suggests it did, with kind of mass conquest led by Joshua and his armies, and the walls came tumbling down. It did not play out that way. In fact, some of the leading theories are that the Israelites were actually an indigenous tribe among many other Canaanite tribes who, for various reasons, both because of religious difference, cultural difference, not necessarily ethnic difference or even linguistic difference, they came to see themselves as having a common identity and a common story, distinguished from the other Canaanite peoples. One way or another, we know that an Israelite identity arises and a civilization of Israelite people did in fact live in this land in biblical times, actually was able to create a monarchy, probably a monarchy that lasted for 3 generations and not much more, maybe 80 to 100 years, and then split into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. But there's clearly a sense of common identity. And I think the literature itself not only reflects that sense, but actually produces it. In other words, the people who were writing the Bible had a political agenda to present the Israelite people as a cohesive unit. Many scholars believe, in fact, it probably wasn't like that at all. It was probably different tribes that had occasional reason to play together, usually in war. Like when the Philistines came along, it was a threat at the national level, and the tribes had to put aside their internecine differences to actually be an Israelite people and put the needs of the Commonwealth ahead of their own tribal needs. Again, there's a lot that goes into this. What you read in the Bible, what you read in the Torah cannot be taken as history, but a combination of the literature and the archaeology produces a sense that people with a common Israelite identity, and you notice I'm avoiding the word Jewish at this point, were coalescing in this part of the world between the years 1000 and 700 BCE. So for a few centuries, you have the development of a cohesive Israelite nation as a national identity in this land. The Israelites are basically piddly compared to the great empires of the time and the place. The Assyrian Empire to the north, vast and powerful. The Egyptian Empire to the southwest, vast and powerful. These 2 imperial entities were constantly warring with each other, and the Israelites were kind of trapped in the middle. So if you get this sense that, but wait a minute, the story is that the Israelites are the center of history. Yeah, it's because it's our story. Right? That isn't, the real reality is that the real powers were the Assyrians to the north, the Egyptians to the south. This was always the case for millennia, and the story of the Israelites, or later the Jews, was just the people trapped in the middle. It almost doesn't matter in so much as Jewish people carry a legitimate sense of indigeneity in this part of the world, one that is backed up robustly by history and by archaeology. Okay, so that's a long way. It's like filled with disclaimers, because I really don't believe that claiming that God gave us this land to our patriarchs and matriarchs in perpetuity makes for a great case for why Israel should exist today. I hear a lot of that, and I say, well, that's ridiculous. right? I mean, the Pledge of Allegiance is also not a great way of expressing why America is a legitimate nation. One nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, it's nice, it makes you feel good. But I don't think that it's a great claim for why Americans deserve a nation of our own. Okay. I saw Gary's hand up in the back.
Well, I was actually just curious, when you're coming to it, what the linkage is between the Israelite identity
Right.
and Judaism.
Right.
Are there non-Jews in that?
Yeah, great question, Gary. And then we're going to get to peoplehood, right? So all of this is a way of saying that even as we were living in this land, we developed a sense of cohesive national identity. But even in biblical times, I think that our national identity was also transnational. Our peoplehood was not only about living in this land. And a lot of that is because of the traumatic and ever-changing history of Israelite people in this time. In 722, the Assyrian armies, which had already for more than a century been oppressing the Israelite nation by taxing them. Basically, for more than 100 years, the Assyrians had made the northern part of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, its vassal state, right? Like they do, you go in, you conquer. The Israelites didn't have much military strength, and they impose extremely high taxes. And eventually, the people get a little bit restive, and the Assyrians decide to put down the rebellions, and they just destroy the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. Any of you have ever heard of the so-called lost tribes of Israel? Are actually familiar with this trauma of 722 BCE when the Assyrians overthrew the northern entire 10 tribes of Israel, leaving only 2 left. Big brother and little brother kingdoms of Judah and Benjamin, which were in the south, and contained Jerusalem, but also the Negev. So they actually contained the main seat of the Jewish civilization, the Judean civilization, named for the tribe of Judah, which has its own parcel of land, and this little smaller territory called Benjamin. So Judah and Benjamin remain, but only for another 140 some odd years, and then the Babylonians came in and conquered that territory in 586. All BCE. After that, the leadership was exiled. The leadership was probably decapitated, metaphorically, but maybe also literally. The story is that Jews lived in Babylonia for 70 years. Anytime you hear a nice round number like 70, you should say, really? Was it 70? They were then, when the Babylonians were overthrown by the Persians, Koresh, or Cyrus the Great, set an edict so that the Jews could go back and reestablish their commonwealth in and around Jerusalem, this time in the territory of Judea alone, and therefore the people are henceforth known as Judeans, which is just Yehudim in Hebrew, which is Jews. You say somebody is Jewish, you're saying it's the same as Judean in Hebrew. So that's when people start adopting this language of Jews. Probably they did it in Babylonian exile. So this is really related to what Smolenskin is trying to convey. A lot of our national identity was forged not in relationship with this land, but actually outside the land. Being kicked out of Judea and having to live in Babylonia for a few generations actually forged a sense of national identity and purpose. It may well be that if we were ever a people living in Egyptian slavery, it is exactly that condition that made us feel like we were a common nation, different from our Egyptian masters, right? There's nothing like, I'm sure that's the same is true for enslaved Africans in the United States, because they came from all different places. And Africa at the time, of course, even today, is very tribal. So, and different languages, different customs, different spiritual beliefs, different religious practices, right? But you're an enslaved African for 300 years, and all of a sudden, you take on a national identity that is not, by the way, American. Right? Black Americans who came over here as enslaved Africans have their own distinct national identity, which is a mix of things. Of course, it's partly American, but I would say it transcends this land. Similarly for Jews, a history of trauma, a history of being uprooted from places, and therefore our peoplehood had to develop structures and systems that would allow us to thrive as a people, even without monarchy, army, government, territory, all of those things, right? So I think that's what Smolenskin is really getting at, that we developed a strong sense of commonality as a people. Calendar. The Jewish calendar was actually developed in Babylonia. So how we mark time, how we tell a common story, we call that Torah or Tanakh, right? We wrote a story of our national mythos, which I love the word myth, by the way. I never use it disparagingly. Myth just means master story. Is it true? Of course it's true. It's true the same way Hamlet is true. You don't read Hamlet in order to derive historical truth about Denmark in the 12th century. You read Hamlet because it sheds light on the human condition. I hate this disparaging of fiction. It's ridiculous. Your kids learn fiction in English class because it's important for the development of a human being to understand stories. So our story is called Torah, and some of it is rooted in history, but even more, it's the document of our peoplehood. Right? So we have this identity that is linked to a land, but also allows us to survive outside the land. Then, as it so happens, we do come back, but one empire after another becomes the regional power. First the Persians, then the Parthians, and then Alexander the Great in 333 BCE conquers the whole territory, and all of a sudden we're Greek. We're not Greek, but the dominant civilization and ways of life, and of course we're paying taxes to the empire. And then the Romans set up a principality in this part of the world. And eventually, we managed to reclaim power. We have land, a military, a monarchy, and a priesthood, all because of a rabble-rousing band of country priests named the Hasmoneans. You know them as the Maccabees, who got sick and tired of what was then the regional power, the Greek puppet state set up in what was Syria. We're going to be hearing this story in just a few weeks. Hanukkah's just 3 weeks from now. Not even. Yeah, 3 weeks from now. And they used force of arms to overthrow the oppressive, puppet state that Antiochus had set up. And they set up their own dynasty. Within a generation, it became completely corrupt. That's beside the point, but they were awful. The descendants of the Maccabees were just awful. But we actually expanded our territory at the time to the largest it had been since King David. And then the Romans came in and said, enough of you Maccabees, enough of you Hasmoneans. And by the way, the Hasmoneans were in Bialik's poem. Said, we used to be the scions of the lions, right? The sons of the Maccabees. Now look at us. Victims of horrific slaughter. And there are accounts that in Kishinev, by the way, pregnant women had their fetuses removed with axes and it just horrific things, the likes of which you couldn't believe unless you lived through October 7th, and then you can believe it. And this, by the way, is such an embedded trauma, particularly for Israelis who know this poem because they study it in school. For Israelis, October 7th, 2023 was Kishinev all over again, right? And only about 130 some odd Jews died in Kishinev. So a tenfold massacre. So if you want to understand what October 7th means to Israelis, just as a side note. So a people kind of with a land, but also not always with a land. And I think that's what Smolenskin is really getting at. I'll skim through a lot of the other big history stuff on the assumption you know it. The Romans become an increasingly oppressive empire to the Jewish people. Depends on who they set up as their governor. Some of the governors include folks whose names you know and may or may not like Herod, who was a paranoiac, crazy megalomaniac leader, but who curried favor with the Jews by spending lots of money on public works and built a huge temple that was just glorious, the eighth wonder of the world. Some of them whose names you know, like Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor in what was then Judea at the time that Jesus walked the earth, and he suppressed the rebellion of Jesus and his followers, but of course blamed the Jews. Of course he's going to blame the Jews. And by the way, I don't think the Jewish leadership liked Jesus either. That's a different story. The Jews again decide we can't deal with this Roman Empire, and they take up arms. And in the year 70, war breaks out. It's a rebellion of the Judeans against their Roman governors. And we lose. I'm simplifying. There were many glorious battles and whatnot, but no, we lost. We lost bad. And in the year 74, the rebellion was finally put down at its last outpost where the most zealous fighters had holed themselves up, a mountaintop fort built by the paranoiac, megalomaniac governor Herod 100 years earlier, way out in the Judean desert, the most inhospitable place on the entire planet. You know it as Masada. The rebellion at Masada was probably put down violently. The myth that we tell is that all of the people on Masada committed suicide rather than being taken captive by the Romans. Most of them were probably raped and taken captive or murdered on Masada. That's what most scholars believe. But we persist in this myth that no, it would have been better to martyr ourselves. So maybe some people did, but the idea of mass suicide on Masada, again, there's no evidence to support that. There is evidence that mass numbers of Jews were enslaved by the Romans and carted off in shackles, exactly the way the Arch of Titus depicts, if any of you have seen that great artifact in Rome. Well, that wasn't the end of Jewish settlement in this land, but it was the beginning of the end, because another 60 some odd years later, in the 130s, a Jewish revolutionary named Bar Kokhba says, you know what, it's time for a revolution. And he really has these kind of messianic delusions. He's going to fight against the Romans. Again, the Jews rise up. He has the backing of the most prominent rabbi of the time, a dude named Akiva, and we lose again. And this time the Romans are not putting up with any more Jewish settlement in and around this area. They rename the territory Palestina, which is a thumb in the eye of the Jewish people. The Romans renamed it for the enemy of the biblical Jews, the Philistines. So that was a Roman, it's a Latin word, Palestina. So they call it Palestine as a way of erasing the Jewish connection to the land. You know, genocide is more than just violent erasure of a group through blood. Genocide can also include suppression of religion. The Soviets were great at genocide against Jews, right? Because they really tried to remove all traces of Jewish culture. You couldn't belong to a synagogue. You couldn't practice Jewish holidays. That's why the last time I marched in Washington when I was 15, it was for Soviet Jewry. When they came out from under the Iron Curtain, they knew they were Jewish, but it's not like they knew what to do, how to build a sukkah, right? They didn't know the prayers for Shabbat. They didn't know Lecha Dodi, because they weren't allowed, because it was a genocidal program to erase not just Jews, but Jewish identity. So Jews come out of the Bar Kokhba revolt and basically are kicked out of the land. And that's when we talk about diaspora. That's when our diaspora story begins. Now, we never stopped dreaming of, who said dreams? Dream of returning home. We never stopped dreaming of returning home. And I think it is fair to say one of the Zionisms is the religious ideology encoded in our prayers, in our poetry, throughout 2,000 years of Jewish dispersion, that we would come back to this place where we had this ancestral tie. Again, I'm cautious around using words like indigenous because we're not the only indigenous people to this territory. Okay, let's do a little more reading. Great. This is Smolensk, and you can even see Smolenskin's writing developing in a certain direction. 6 years later, he writes an essay called The Haskalah of Berlin. Okay, a little language and terminology with a little history behind it. The Haskalah, lehaskil is a Hebrew word that actually contains a root that most of you know. So Haskalah comes from the Hebrew word sechel. Sechel, what is sechel? Common sense. It literally means intelligence. But sechel, as colloquially used, and many of you probably thought it was a Yiddish word, which it is, but it's directly from the Hebrew. Sechel, the root is Hebrew, and it means intelligence or wisdom, but it's almost always colloquially used to mean common sense, right? That kid has a lot of smarts, he got 1,600 on his SATs, but not a lot of sechel, right? Not a lot of sechel. I know people like that. Seems to be in a certain typology indigenous among today's Jewish people. A lot of book smarts, not always the most street smart, sechel, right? So haskalah comes from sechel, but it's just the Jewish word for the intellectual revolution that is prompted by the European Enlightenment starting in the 1770s. The same intellectual, social, and political revolutionary forces that produced the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the philosophy of Locke and Hobbes made its way into the Declaration of Independence. This idea, all men are created equal, that was not like that was a brand new idea, right? A break with feudalism, a break with the classism that was embedded in European society, that nobility was up here and the rest of everyone was down here and Jews were beneath down there, right? All of that was being shattered through this huge perfect storm of intellectual revolution, social revolution, political revolution, embodied in not only the thinkers I've named, but also in war leaders like Napoleon, whose conquest was ideologically motivated by the desire to liberate Europe from its old ways and introduce a whole new Europe, one based on emancipation of all. And by the way, Jews greeted Napoleon's conquests as a conquering hero. Jews lauded Napoleon because one of the first things he did was, in decapitating monarchies across Europe, they would allow Jews to be released from the ghettos and attain citizenship for the first time in 2,000 years, or however many hundreds of years Jews had lived in various host countries where Napoleon came through. So we call this period the Enlightenment. You've learned about it, your kids have learned about it in school. But there was a very specific Jewish Enlightenment as well. And the Haskalah is really the intellectual currents that were changing Judaism, largely as Jews emerged from the ghettos and started to interact with non-Jewish people in their various host communities. And realized, like, whoa, I could be a university professor and not just a malamed in my kid's cheder, right? Jews had aspirations to actually participate in modern society. Some of those Jews would do that in such a radical and deliberate way that they identified themselves as reformers. And they were specifically focused on reforming Jewish religious practice in conversation with modernity. You know these people because the middle name of this synagogue is Westchester Reform Temple. Like, we are the direct byproduct, 200 years later, of this kind of work. Don't let anyone tell you that reform is something new, by the way. Reform traces its roots. The first synagogue to call itself a Reform synagogue, 1810 in Germany. It's old, right? It's 213 years old. So the Haskalah was this huge upheaval in Jewish intellectual life. And Smolenskin has a comment here. 100 years after the Enlightenment begins, it is assuring us that as a reward, in assuring us that as a reward for, quote, enlightenment, we would be able to establish our homes wherever we happen to be, they, meaning Gentile European society, all right? So the argument here is that they promised us 100 years ago in the Enlightenment that when we went free from the ghettos, that we could just modernize and assimilate into European society. And we could have Jewish homes, we could practice our religion freely, we wouldn't have to live in these squalid ghettos, we could have the same career and professional and family opportunities as anyone else in Gentile European society, particularly in the West, France, Germany, Western Europe, right? That was what the promise of the Enlightenment was supposed to be for the Jew. He goes on to say, so they have told us to abandon all hope of returning to our own land and living there in dignity as all other peoples do. That's what he's arguing. He's saying, we didn't really need a Zionism because we were told in the Enlightenment, you can live here, you're welcome here. All right, think about the promise of America to most of your ancestors, right? 4 Jews emigrated from Europe to America for every one who made Aliyah to what was then Palestine in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the same forces may have driven us from our homes, but most of us are here because our ancestors came here instead of to Palestine. Why? Probably better living opportunity. Not ideologically motivated, no real sense of personal connection to this squalid piece of land populated by a bunch of backward Arab tribes and villages. Their perception would have been. Even barbaric peoples. There's a lot of, I would say, anti-Arab and anti-Orientalist prejudice in the writing of some of the early Zionists. They just thought they were going to this backwater with backwater people. We'll see how that works out. All right, he goes on to say, And we, having seen that all this did not get us anywhere, and that it did not even help us secure the love we sought, meaning the love from Europe, we declare, only a dog neither has nor wants a home. A man who chooses to live his whole life as a transient without a thought for the establishment of a permanent home for his children will forever be regarded as a dog. And we must seek a home with all our hearts, our spirit, our soul. What was happening that allowed a Smolenskin to write this way? And particularly, what shifted in the 6 years or 7 years between the first essay and the second essay? Well, the answer is a lot. And the person who I think paid the greatest attention to what was happening throughout Europe, particularly Western Europe, was a fellow born in an upper middle class Jewish household in Pest, which was one half of what would later be Budapest in Hungary, but moved with his family as a young adult to Vienna, where he was raised in high Viennese culture and the academy, and became a journalist. And his name, of course, was Theodor Herzl. An assimilated Jewish family, if ever there were one, right? Herzl was not a traditional Jew. Don't let the big beard fool you. Right? That is not, he was not an Orthodox, right? A lot of people say, oh, the Orthodox looking, no, that was stylish at the time. Beards were in. Beards, long beards, right? Told Kelly, like, Kelly's on the road right now, and she sees when we FaceTime, and I say, so you growing a beard again? I say, yep, I'm going full Herzl. Full Herzl this time. No, so I like to tease her about that. She prefers me clean-shaven, but she's on the road. So Herzl observed a lot of what was happening in Western Europe. And you have to understand, this felt like a massive betrayal of the Jewish people of Europe 100 years after the Enlightenment, because they were raised on the idea, whole generations of Jews were raised on the idea that they were just like every other European. Right? This was a revolutionary idea in its time, but by the late 1800s, most Jews believed that their path was through assimilation and that it was perfectly acceptable. Jews, of course, would be accepted to the highest levels of society. How many of you have seen Leopoldstadt? Right? That's the story of Leopoldstadt, these generations of Viennese Jews who are very disconnected from their Jewish practice and Jewish heritage. The first scene is decorating a Christmas tree. Right? Tom Stoppard knows what he's doing. Like, it's this jarring image, and of course, the kid is putting a Jewish star on top. And the family's like, no, that's the wrong one for this. But it's a Jewish family decorating their home with a Christmas tree because, yeah, like Herzl's family, not an unrealistic portrayal of Jewish life. And by the way, there are some similarities to Jews in America. And I think post-October 7th, many of us, for the first time, are feeling like, wait a minute, this is really jarring because we're being treated like we're different. Like, how, like, we've always been treated like we're one of you. We believe in all the same things. And then all of a sudden, anti-Semitism on college campuses, a lot of stuff, Jew baiting, a lot of gaslighting, a lot of, just a war of explosive and inflammatory language, Jews being targeted for assisting genocide, apartheid, white supremacy, settler colonialism, all of these really awful, noxious lies about that really find their origin in anti-Semitic propaganda that goes back centuries. Like these blood libels, really, that Jews are taking glee in murdering Palestinian children. That is not far removed from the blood libel of Jews killing Christian children and using their blood for their own nefarious purposes. And we feel that deeply, even if it's not what the speakers actually intend, because I assume that most people who use these words are actually ignorant. And that Palestinian propaganda is very effective, and it takes root in ignorant minds. So, hard to argue with an ignoramus, by the way. Maybe not worth our time. But we have to argue in the public square for the intelligent readers. Okay, so Theodor Herzl, we're going to skip to him. No, we're going to read a little bit from another Russian novelist, Leon Pinsker. Okay, again, to Len's brilliant opening question about who are we, just a few lines from Pinsker in an essay called Auto-Emancipation, an appeal to his people by a Russian Jew. Again, 100 years after the failed promise that Jews would be emancipated from second-class citizenship or worse in Europe, he writes these words: "The Jewish people lacks most of the essential attributes which define a nation." He takes it, though, as an article of faith that we're a people. right? Similar to Smolenskin. It lacks that authentic, rooted life, which is inconceivable without a common language and customs and without geographic cohesion. The Jewish people has no fatherland of its own, though many motherlands. I think you get the metaphor, right? We live in lots of different places where we have been welcomed to varying degrees, but no one cohesive land, place. No center of focus or gravity, no government of its own, no official representation. The Jews are home everywhere, but nowhere at home. Love that line. And since the Jews are nowhere at home, nowhere regarded as native, they remain aliens everywhere. This is what I talked about on Friday night. My remarks are on my blog, rabbiblake.org. He actually, read the last paragraph. This is fascinating. In order to build a secure home and end our endless life of wandering and rise to the dignity of a nation in our own eyes and in the eyes of the world, we must above all not dream of restoring ancient Judea. We shall take with us the most sacred possessions we have saved from the shipwreck of our former country, the God idea and the Bible. It is these alone which have made our old fatherland the Holy Land and not Jerusalem or the Jordan. Perhaps the Holy Land will again become ours. He's responding to conversations arising among Jewish intellectuals and activists about Palestine. Maybe we should go to Palestine. And this was a huge debate, by the way. Where to go? The Jewish question, as it is often called at this time in our history, the late 19th century, is what to do about the fact that Jews cannot live and thrive and be a people of self-determination in Europe anymore. All right? It is a gathering storm of disillusionment that leads at least a significant number of Jews to conclude this can no longer be our home. And some of us got that. Some of our ancestors got that and came here through Ellis Island, starting at around the same time, the 1880s, the massive waves of immigration, mostly from Eastern Europe, by the way. Some of us got it after Kishinev, my family, many of your families based on the number of hands. Some of us got it after World War I, when the crumbling of empires did not actually result in a Europe that was more hospitable to Jews, despite interesting blips on the historical landscape like the Weimar Republic in Germany of the 1920s, which gave Jews a false sense of security in Germany and Austria. And some didn't get it until Hitler came to power. And 6 million at least never got it. Right. So it's really important, though, when you hear pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel propaganda suggesting that, look, what happened in the Holocaust was awful, but we, the indigenous people of this land, should not be displaced because of the suffering of the Jews. And by the way, that's from the people who are, I would say, intellectual rivals or enemies. Or when you hear Jewish teachers making and rabbis, by the way, making the overly facile argument that, well, the state of Israel was legitimated by the Shoah. And basically the story is we suffered in Europe, and then they murdered 6 million of us, and then we came to Israel, and then 2 years later we established a state. Hooray. That is a very dangerous narrative for the primary reason that it is not true. Jews began to return to this part of the world in the 1870s, trickling at first, and then in large waves of tens of thousands of immigrants, so that by 1933, by 1940, there were already close to 400,000 Jews living in what was then Palestine. Just so you understand where this goes. It was not a small number, by the way, though it was about 1/3 of the total population, the other 2/3 being people who would have at their time called themselves Arabs, for the most part. Mostly Muslim, some Christian. That is a religious identification. But culturally, as a people, they would have said, yeah, we're Arabs. They might have said we're Palestinian Arabs, meaning Arabs who live in a territory that they, for centuries, by the way, called Palestine. But they were not thinking of themselves in national terms, the way Jews did, but maybe didn't have the expression and the language for it until writers like Smolensky and Pinsker, and of course the greatest of all, Theodor Herzl. So let's read some Herzl. Herzl writes a book in 1896, 1 year before wearing his other hat, which was that of a community organizer. He writes a book outlining his vision. The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet is an ancient one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. Why does he say it's ancient? Because we've been putting this in our prayers for 2,000 years. Any pious Jew who reads the Amida, the 18 benedictions, or the Tefillah, the part you stand for, includes a prayer, several prayers that talk about the restoration of Zion, just a biblical word, by the way, for Israel, or the Holy Land, or Jerusalem. It means all of those things. It's a poetic term. But this idea of returning, it is embedded in everything pious Jews have done for the last 2,000 years. Not just poetry and art and music and whatnot, prayer. 3 times a day, Jews prayed that we would someday come back. The Passover Seder, L'Shana Haba'a B'Yerushalayim, like that meant something. The Seder was a diaspora ritual created by the rabbinic community 300 years after Jesus ever walked the earth. So no, the Last Supper was not a Seder. We'll go on. We are a people, one people. You notice how all of them, make this claim as if it is gospel truth, but it's had to, this was also a polemic against those who said you're just a religion, right? Primarily, Jews who were being told they were a religion were like, what are you talking about? What's religion? Like, religion is not actually a Jewish norm. Judaism is a way of life. Judaism is a set of cultural assumptions. It includes language, culture, food, history, mythology, storytelling, land, prayers, religious rituals, how we mark time. But I hate the word religion in describing what we are. We have honestly endeavored everywhere to merge ourselves in the social life of surrounding communities and to preserve the faith of our fathers. We are not permitted to do so. In vain are we loyal patriots, our loyalty in some places running to extremes. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to increase the fame of our native land in science and art, or her wealth by trade and commerce. He's not talking about Israel. He's talking about, like, I am a loyal Austrian, and I have done everything I can to promote Austrian culture. In his other famous book, Alt Neuland, which means the Old New Land, which was a utopian novel about what life in Palestine might look like for a restored Jewish state, he actually talks about Jews putting on tuxedos and going to the opera in Tel Aviv or in Israel. Tel Aviv was founded after he died. But in what would become Israel, to listen to Wagner operas. If you can imagine that. That was the culture that Herzl believed in and defended. Oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has survived such struggles and sufferings as we have gone through. Jew baiting has merely stripped off of our weaklings. The strong among us were invariably true to their race when persecution broke out against them. So what is he talking about here? Like, what are some of the things that Herzl noticed about life in Europe that led him to conclude that this is no longer viable for us? We have tried in vain to build up and be loyal citizens of the various countries in which we find ourselves, and it does not work. So what did Herzl notice? Yeah. That's the big one. I'll explain. So great job, Ruth. Herzl was assigned by the paper he was writing for in Vienna to cover an interesting case taking place in Paris in the 1890s, I believe in 1893, of a French lieutenant named Alfred Dreyfus, who was falsely brought up on anti-Semitic charges. And I'm not going to get into the whole history of the Dreyfus affair. The long story short is Herzl was horrified by what he saw and by the anti-Semitic furor that seized the people of Paris and all of France and, frankly, all of Western Europe, and the way in which this, French lieutenant was basically exiled from his land on false charges of being a traitor. It was not his first encounter with anti-Semitism. Herzl was an avid reader, and he had noticed that even German high intellectuals were publishing virulently anti-Semitic screeds. Another development had taken place in German intellectual life, throughout Europe, which was an obsession starting in the 1870s with race. a lot of this is a perversion of the greatest and most revolutionary scientific theory of the time, which of course was The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And part of the way in which Darwinism got perverted by anti-Semites was to suggest that the Jew has evolved as a distinct race with all sorts of racial features. And the Nazis took this and ran with it, right? Measuring cranium size and shape, claiming that, you know, the hooked nose is a racial defect that identifies the Jew, and that our characteristics of corruption, mendacity, criminality, stinginess, all of the things that were leveled against Jewish people and Jewish communities were in fact racially derived characteristics. Now, this is really important because this is really different from medieval Christian anti-Semitism, which is basically, long story short, your beliefs are wrong. You killed Jesus, you killed Christ, and you still believe that, you know, that he's not the Messiah. Your beliefs are wrong. Oh, they murdered us for that, by the way. They made life miserable for that. But you could change. You could convert, right? Isabella and Ferdinand gave Jews a choice. You can leave or you can become Christian. Now, they interrogated crypto-Jews mercilessly. The Inquisition, by the way, was not targeting Jews. It was targeting Christians to see if they were real Christians. But of course, Jews were part of the program, right? A lot of Jews professed that they were Catholic, but were they really? So offices of the Inquisition were developed to persecute so-called crypto-Jews or hidden Jews. Conversos is the correct term. They also use the derogatory term marrano, which means pig. Right? So that's why we don't use that term to describe the Jews who secretly held on to their Jewish tradition, even though professing to be devoted Catholics to the church, which ruled. Ferdinand and Isabella had basically a revolutionary program, which was one blood, one people, one faith. Only Catholicism in Spain. But the Nazis took this idea, which was already permeating the German academy throughout the latter part of the 1800s, which was that, no, you can't change because it's a race. You're a race. And Herzl even uses that, which is really interesting. I don't think he means to build up that argument, but it is interesting that it makes its way into his thought. So reading on just a little bit, I'm reading the third full paragraph from the bottom where he says, let us first settle the point of staying where we are. Can we hope for better days? Can we possess our souls in patience? Can we wait in pious resignation till the princes and peoples of this earth are more mercifully disposed towards us? I say that we cannot hope for a change in the current of feeling. The nations in whose midst Jews live are all either covertly or openly anti-Semitic. And so he basically says, we need a home. And, you know, I'm not going to read all of this, but Herzl comes around to the core idea, which he declares in front of hundreds of delegates whom he convenes in Basel, Switzerland for the first Zionist Congress in 1897. By the way, he insisted that this was a black tie affair or white tie affair. Formal dress. His best buddy and acolyte, a guy named Max Nordau, also a brilliant Zionist writer and thinker, shows up in, like, I don't know, regular dress clothes. Like, you know, he wasn't wearing jeans, but probably just wearing a coat and tie. And Herzl says, go back to your hotel and change. Jewish delegates came from all over, and with much pomp and circumstance, he greeted them from a high podium in Basel, and he says the following: Zionism demands a publicly recognized and legally secured homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. This platform is unchangeable. And this is his answer to this open inquiry, this open question. What is Zionism? Zionism is the demand for a legally secured, publicly recognized homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, which is the name of the place at the time. That's how Herzl defined it. He is not the only Zionist, but he defined Zionism as a political movement, a political aspiration. And look at all the things that are in that line. It is a demand for a publicly recognized, legally secured, we're not just going to go in with arms and fight for it, needs to be legally obtained, homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And that last point, we'll probably get to it a little bit next week. We still got 15 minutes. We're good. That last point was actually the source of probably the greatest controversies in the early history of the Zionist movements. Even Herzl permitted the next Zionist congresses to discuss the so-called alternative to his plan, which included everything except in Palestine. Where was the chief alternative proposed? Anyone know? The Uganda plan, right. And there was actually a lot of movement behind the Uganda plan. Why? Well, again, read Gordis and you'll get a lot of the ins and outs of this. But even back then, some of the early Zionists recognized that there were people living in Palestine who were not Jews and actually who would not take kindly to Jewish settlement in Palestine. Others feared not so much the Arab villagers who were living there, or the farmers. You know, it was basically an agrarian society. You can imagine that European Jews did in fact look down their noses at these people as backward culturally, especially since they had, white ties and tails and listened to Wagner. You can imagine the culture clash here, that they were very dismissive of the natives. And some of them, though, said, yeah, we don't want to create any problems with the natives. Other people did not want to do business with the imperial power that governed this territory at the time. So, one of the things that's complicated about today's argument over Zionism and the conflict is the accusation of colonialism. Well, colonialism is a dirty word today, but last time I checked, we all began as colonists, right? That's our story too. It is really the story of modern history in the West. And it was in no way shameful for Jews to look to the imperial power at the time and to try to secure a foothold in this land. Those people were the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire, which was based in Istanbul, Constantinople, was a Muslim sultanate. The high power of the Ottoman Empire was the Sultan, and they owned that territory, and they had for several centuries, by the way. The Ottomans, by the way, had been a more hospitable empire for Jews fleeing Spanish persecution than many other parts of the world. Like if you were a Jew who decided when Ferdinand and Isabella said, get out of my country or convert, it was like, no, I'm going to get out. Where could you go? Well, you could go to the Netherlands. Some of them made their way to Great Britain. Some of them went to South America. Some of them went to Italy, not such a good place for the Jew. Some of them went to populate the countries of North Africa. This is the Sephardic diaspora, right? Sepharad is just the Hebrew word for Spain. So Jews who left Spain and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, it's the Iberian diaspora. But the Ottoman Empire, which covered vast swaths of land from the 1600s through the 1900s, was considered to be one of the better places a Jew could go, right? So living in under Ottoman rule, you would never be a first-class citizen. But because it was a Muslim empire run by a sultan, you were considered dhimmi, which means a people of the book, right? You were considered pious enough to be not the lowest class, but like a second-class citizen with certain rights and privileges. So for many Jews fleeing the Spanish expulsion, the Ottoman Empire was actually Turkey and the various parts of the Middle East was not a bad place to settle. And, Jews had thriving civilizations in all of these countries in North Africa and the Middle East and Turkey and Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan and all as far east as India. So some Zionists felt that, let's try and do business with the Ottomans. Others said, we don't want to do business with the Ottomans. The Ottomans already had a record of not allowing land sales to Jews and Christians, I believe as early as the 1860s. Gordis covers it. So there was this huge debate. Do we try and go back to the place that we think of as home, that is now Palestine, with the complications of Arabs who live there and Ottomans who are the governing power? Or do we find a place that's a little bit more of a blank slate? Uganda, for instance. Okay, right. And I can't remember who the imperial power was in Uganda. Probably the Brits. The Brits, right? And Jews generally, at the time, those who favored the Uganda plan, made the case that dealing with the British is better than dealing with the Ottomans or the French or any of the other colonial powers. This will come up again during World War I, when the British and the French are carving up the map. Jews basically said, the Ottoman Empire is going to fall. The Brits thought so too. The French thought so too. So the Brits and French get together, carve up the map. And Jews basically said, yeah, we should basically put all of our marbles in the basket of dealing with the Brits. Because the Brits are known for allowing their colonized nations or colonized territories, the indigenous peoples are kind of allowed to do their own thing with less government interference. In a sultanate like the Ottoman Empire, it's a Muslim theocracy, even a more tolerant one, right? Don't think like Iran of today. That is a very hardline Muslim regime. The Ottomans were much more permissive, but at the end of the day, it's still a Muslim regime. The British had a very different ethos toward places like, like South Africa. Not South Africa was Dutch, but like India is the big one. Didn't work out so well for them either. I mean, eventually, the Commonwealth, that is to say the United Kingdom and all of its colonies, has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking as the colonized peoples seek their own independence. Sometimes, like in India, through mostly nonviolent means. That's what Gandhi's historical significance was. In other cases, through violent revolution. Okay, we've got a few more minutes. I'm going to do a little bit more reading, and then we'll take some questions. So I want to make it clear that at least for Herzl, Zionism is a political objective. For Herzl and his followers, the main idea is a legally secured, publicly recognized homeland for the Jewish people in the land of Palestine, which, though Herzl, responding to the critique from the anti-Palestine group, said, well, we'll open this up for debate. And the debate, by the way, at the next Zionist Congresses almost tore the delegates apart. Eventually, in order to kind of stop Jews from fighting with each other, which is like what we were doing until October 6th, they had to get behind one platform. And that would eventually, of course, be Palestine. It has to be Palestine. Herzl is not the only person who is invested in Zionism as a response to the Jewish question. Again, the Jewish question is what to do about the fact that Jews in Europe cannot ever really be a free and self-realized people. And we are a people. It's not just about practicing our religion. We want to have our own national identity, our own culture, our own folkways, all safely. That's on here too. Right? So all of this is getting kind of mapped into the various ideologies that are known as Zionism. So for some people, Zionism is not primarily about securing a political reality on the ground. Consider, for instance, Aleph Dalet Gordon, the great labor Zionist. Just read a line or two from him. At times, he writes, you imagine that you too are taking root in the soil in which you are digging. Like all that is growing around, you are nurtured by the light of the sun's rays with food from heaven, that you too live in common with the tiniest blade of grass, with each flower, each tree. Wow. What kind of a person writes this, and what's he talking about? Well, for Gordon, Zionism was about putting down your dusty old prayer books and Talmud volumes, picking up a pickaxe and a shovel, moving to Palestine, draining swamps, and getting your hands dirty with the soil of the Holy Land, which he romanticizes here. Like, he makes it sound like you're going to this Garden of Eden and walking among the grass. Like, remember, these are like European shtetl people. He, by the way, was this nerdy, weak, physically weak, constantly plagued by illness. How old was he when he died? He made it pretty far. He was 50 plus another 16 years, 66 years old. So Gordon put down his old life, and he said Zionism for him was not just about the land, it was also about reinventing the Jew. Right? So Zionism is more than just about securing a political reality, the way Herzl defined it, though that, I think, is the encompassing movement that drives immigration. But for some, it was also about an internal transformation of the Jew. One way you effectuate that transformation is by putting down the trappings of the old world Jew, the intellectual, weak Jew, and picking up tools and getting your hands dirty and toiling. And for some, by the way, it was even more than that. It was all of those things, and it was also training yourself to be a militia and fighting and becoming the new Jew. We'll get to this a lot in the next few weeks, because you need to understand that Zionism is not this monolithic idea, and that in early pre-state Israel, there were really significant clashes between Jews who were coming over in waves of immigration in increasingly dire circumstances, by the way, as we get closer and closer and closer, and then in World War II, and then they cut off immigration. The Brits cut off immigration in the 1930s. We'll cover this next week. Reduced it vastly. So a lot of this, though, was about transformation, not just of Jewish destiny. It was about transforming the Jew. Okay. And then finally, a couple of other ideas here. I've included this beautiful poem, Ve'ulai, which means perhaps, by Rachel Blustein, the great pre-state poet of the Zionist movement. And you can just feel the labor Zionist in her coming to the fore in her beautiful words, where she's really romanticizing the Kinneret, which is the Sea of Galilee, which is the banks of the Galilee, or the kibbutz she moved to. These work collectives, these labor collectives, and how she romanticizes work, the wagon laden with sheaves, my voice ringing with song, bathed in the clean Kinneret. That's what she's dreaming about. She's dreaming about a new Judaism that is rooted in the very geography and topography of this new place. Also a very sickly woman, died at 41. A lot of these Jews, they toiled, they had never been, they were not born for this kind of work. And they basically worked themselves to death. And thousands of them died of malaria and of heart failure and of just the stress of what they thought they were going to, this romantic paradise. And it's like, oh my God, have you ever drained a malarial swamp? Right. Achad Ha'am, I won't read this. This is your homework. Achad Ha'am, Avraham Kook, and Zev Jabotinsky. We're going to come to them next week. So I didn't get quite as far as I wanted, but we got far. Three different expressions of what Zionism means. For Achad Ha'am, he actually didn't care so much about returning to Palestine, but he thought that Judaism and Jewish culture in Europe was dead and was a dead end. So he speaks a lot about revitalizing Judaism. So you have to understand that what they were responding to was not just the political dead end of Jews living in Europe. They also were responding to the fact that Judaism had become a dead thing. So many of the early Zionist ideologues were very much or more invested in revitalizing Judaism too, at a time where, because perhaps of entrenched anti-Semitism in Europe, but also because of a lot of Jewish cultural norms and life in the ghetto for hundreds and hundreds of years, they needed a new Judaism to go along with Herzl's political dream. So Achad Ha'am is very much the father of cultural Zionism, or it's sometimes even called secular Zionism, though he was hardly secular. He just wasn't into traditional prayer. He really believed that revitalizing Judaism was the fulfillment of Judaism, revitalizing it in conversation with all of the new possibilities that the political reality might attain for the Jews. Avraham Kook is a rabbi. He says, there can be no future for the Jewish people or a Jewish state unless it is actually religiously Jewish. So he actually believes that you can't actually throw away the baby with the bathwater. What he wanted to do was have a Zionist enterprise that was rooted in the traditional religious doctrine. And then finally, I've given a little bit about Zev Jabotinsky, which I call Jabotinsky's revisionist Zionism. He's not really revising so much. It's more a matter of degree. The Jabotinsky movement is basically responding to the question of how far are you willing to go to accomplish what Herzl dreamed of? For Jabotinsky, I think of it as Zionism on steroids. Jabotinsky is the one who actually proposes that you will have to take up arms and fight and possibly die if you want to attain what Herzl dreamed of. So Jabotinsky puts in very real terms what's on the table for the Jews. I'm going to stop there and ask if anyone has a few questions. I recognize today was a lot to get through. It's like basic just lecture format. I'm grateful for your presence. We'll have a little bit more time for interactivity, I think, as we get into this some more, but so much to cover. Jim. Yep. The influence of Kishinev on what was then, I think, the Fourth Zionist Congress, we can talk about that a little bit more next week, Gordis takes it up, cannot be underestimated. Kishinev was like October 7th, an absolutely galvanizing event, especially when Bialik went there to report on what he saw, and he wrote In the City of Slaughter. It was a moment that changed things. So whereas Herzl might have been derided as kind of an idealistic dreamer before 1903, after 1903, after Kishinev, there was no question left among Europe's Jews, we have to get out. Now again, more of them came here than went there. But there was no real controversy among Jews in Europe who said, I shouldn't say that. Some, as we know, many, as we know, did not leave. But many left. Millions of Jews were already on their way. Kishinev accelerated that, like by significant orders of magnitude, and it absolutely forced the hand of the Zionist Congress to step up their efforts to create this political reality, because they were seeing it's dire. They're not just going to bar us from the academy or boycott our businesses, no Jews allowed, right? Or call us Christ killers till the end of days, or tell us that we're racially defective. They're going to murder us in our homes with our babies in our wombs. That's what Kishinev meant for the Jew. It was October 7th. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is why October 7th in some ways is so consequential, because it didn't happen in a non-Jewish land. It happened in Israel, right? And so that's led many, I mean, the real feeling in Israel right now is such rage, not only at Hamas, of course at Hamas. Israelis are, very united in their willingness to fight Hamas to the bitter end. That's not the issue. The country is bitterly angry at its own government because they really feel that the government wasn't there. Where was the IDF for 12 hours on October 7th? Like, that's what people are saying. Why were 8 times as many battalions of the IDF marshaled on or in the West Bank, many cases protecting rabble-rousers, Jewish rabble-rousers, by the way? Just saying, why were they there and only 24 battalions in and around the West Bank, 3 on the border with Gaza? I mean, the Israeli people have a long, bitter, difficult reckoning ahead of them. We're going to take up more of this next week. I have to go dedicate a garden. Thank you, my friends.